Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessel Noor in Baltimore. We're continuing our discussion about the book, Why Do We Kill? The Pathology of Murder in Baltimore. We're joined by the book's two authors. We're joined by Kelvin Sewell. He's a Baltimore born and raised 22-year, now retired veteran murder police. He won many awards and recognitions along the way. He currently serves as the chief of police of Pocomoke on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. His co-author is Stephen Janis. He's a longtime award-winning investigative journalist, currently an investigative producer with Fox 45. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to be here.
Okay, so you start your book by talking about the box. And people will know what the box is because it's on every murder show. It's where you, as a homicide detective, you interrogate your suspects. And this is where you kind of square off with them. Some of, the people you talked about in the book they were all guilty of the crimes they were accused of. And oftentimes you knew they were guilty, but you had to get them to talk.
That's correct.
So talk about what you did. The first thing you would say to these people, these suspects, to get them to talk, and why?
Well, some cases are different, but the individuals. And when you go into the box is about maybe an 8 by 10 size room, and with any interview room, a table and 3 chairs, one for a primary and secondary detective, the other one for the person that you are interviewing or interrogating in reference to the crime they committed. And basically, you get people inside the interview room that, again, what we call the box, and we try to get them to confess the crimes that they committed, mainly homicides. And a lot of times you meet individuals who don't want to cooperate, who try to act like they don't understand what you're talking about, like the crime that they committed. So sometimes you got to break the ice a little bit. You got to go into other kind of investigative tools. One I developed called, let's start by saying your ABCs. And you'd be surprised, there's a lot of smart people in Baltimore.
So that's probably the last thing anyone would expect to hear.
Exactly, that's the last thing anyone want to hear. I want to know if you're capable of understanding me, if you know your ABCs. A lot of educated people in Baltimore City, but a lot of people who are committing these crimes don't understand the 26 letters of the English, the letters that our alphabets. So what I try to do is get them to break the ice by having them say their ABCs. And you would be surprised, these criminals out there committing these crimes, probably because of the miseducation they've been receiving growing up, don't know the 26 letters of the alphabet.
And you said in the book, not a single person who was convicted of murder that you investigated could recite the alphabet.
Not the ones that had to use that technique for could not recite the alphabet, no.
Well, I was going to say, I remember when Kelvin told me that one of the reasons we started the book off was that was just, to me, so emblematic of the problem, that people are not versed in the language of society. That only signifies, I think, more even deeply their isolation, which is a big theme that Kelvin and I would talk about. You go out to these neighborhoods that are basically like dysfunctional oases, where nothing really works, and especially the education system. And so, there aren't many options. And it was just that when Kelvin told me that story, I was just dumbfounded. But also in the sense, it sort of made sense in a lot of ways as to why, certain parts of Baltimore seem stubbornly violent.
And so you talk about your interactions with many of these suspects. Tell us about the first suspect you talk about in your book. He has a nickname. His nickname was Aunt Mo. Talk about who that was and why you wanted to share that story in the book.
This was a case involving an individual by the name of Pedro Taylor.
Pedro Taylor, yeah.
Pedro Taylor was a local gang member from the Treetop Peru, which is a knockoff from the Blood Gang. And Pedro Taylor was given a task by the OG, which is the head of the gang, that Treetop Peru gang, to go deliver some money to the Baltimore County Detention Center to give to one of the other gang members who was arrested. I believe it was like $200. Pedro Taylor decided
it was $200.
Yeah, he wasn't going to do that, so he decided he didn't make that trip and kept the money. And when we got a call to respond to the red carpet inn up at Ricerstown Road in Baltimore City, that's when we discovered that that something had occurred in that room, prior to us even going to the red carpet, then we got a call out to Lincoln Park in Baltimore City, where we found Pedro Taylor's body. It was burnt. It was burnt to no end. You couldn't tell who the individual was just by that body laying in the park. So what drew us back to the red carpet end was the individuals who killed Pedro Taylor had wrapped him up in the blanket that was actually in the red carpet end. He was killed, he was beaten there, but he didn't die until he got to Lincoln Park. And Pedro was put into the trunk of a car inside that blanket. They decided to clean the room up. And so they took the phone, they took the remote control to the TV, and they also took another device. And they put it all in the blanket with Pedro Taylor, put him in the trunk of the car.
And I think a pillow too.
The pillow.
Yeah, they had a pillow.
And they all drove to Lincoln Park to...
Which our audience might know from the show Serial on NPR.
Yes.
Because it's known as like a burial
dumping
ground for a dumping ground for bodies in Baltimore.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Found a lot of bodies there.
Yeah.
And what these young, I'm going to call them young criminals did.
They were teenagers.
Teenagers, yes. They
were teenagers.
They were teenagers. They took Pedro out of the blanket, and they put the blanket on the side, and they put and they laid his body out, and they doused his body with gasoline and set him on fire. And
remember that Emma dropped that. They said later he dropped the match
Yes.
on their body. Like I guess it was sort of like a flourish. He picked it up and dropped it,
Yes.
supposedly, according to the people you talked to. And then when you were up there on Homicide, Kelvin told me this story, is one of those stories that is so, like, I guess representative of how he is as a police officer, because he's sitting there and Ammo is smoking a cigarette, and Kelvin tells him to put the match out with his fingers, which is like just something. There aren't many cops who are going to tell you a moment like that, a moment that's very human, right? Because it's not like something you would expect a police officer to do or even share, and then Ammo doesn't want to do it.
And he said, it's going to burn my finger. I said, how do you think Pedro Taylor felt when you doused him and set him on fire? And Pedro was still alive. Because we did the autopsy on Pedro, he had burnt leads in the system.
He had been stabbed like 20 times.
20 times.
He was lying there.
So he was still breathing because the medical examiner found leaves in his lungs, meaning that when they dropped that match, he was still breathing.
Yes.
So, this case, the case of the bin, is just. I think for people to understand it, but a lot of things to people, murders are some sort of thing to watch, and it's kind of interesting. But like, go up to Reisterstown Road, and one of the reasons we were so descriptive, go to that hotel and look around and just get the sense of the bleakness of that area and the bleakness of the lives where people would say, well, we're not just going to kill this guy, but we're going to wait, we're going to beat him up, then put him in the trunk and drive around. One of the girls went to a gas station and poured out some soda and filled it with gasoline, so they had gasoline to burn. It was so premeditated. And I mean, we don't know exactly what happened, but it seems that there was no one at that time, I think it was Kelvin was saying to me, nobody said, maybe we shouldn't do this. We just beat him up. I mean, as we point out in the book, if they just left him in the hotel room that day, he would have recovered, and it would have been a minor crime.
Exactly.
But the whole idea of driving around the city, going to Lincoln Park, making this very conscious decision is one of those things I think is inexplicable in terms of human nature. It's the type of stuff that Kelvin sees that just, it's hard to really understand on any level of humanity, but I think it speaks to some of the other issues that we don't think about that must some way infiltrate this process,
And so, go ahead.
And remember, Pedro was still alive because once they got to the Lincoln Park, they felt some movement inside the trunk. That's when they decided to stab him about 21 times. And at that point, he still didn't die because of the burnt leaves in the system. What got us back to the red carpet end was the items that they took out of the hotel room, the phone and the remote control and the other, forget the other device they took out of there, and it had the address of the hotel. So that's why when we finished the scene there at Lincoln Park, we responded up to the hotel, and that's where we discovered the room where he was actually beat up in, and the blood and everything else. So we knew the actual scene took place there.
And this is all caught on, and the taking of the body from the room to the car was all caught on surveillance tape.
Yes, and then once we got the individuals identified on the surveillance tape, we started bringing them in one at a time. And then, by being teenagers tend to they talk. A lot of teenagers talk, and they start, well, who is this? Who is this? This is so and so. This is so and so. So we got to identify everybody who was involved in that incident, and as a result, it was a successful case that was prosecuted in Baltimore City Court.
And from the book, you wrote what struck you was the attitude of these young men and women that took part in this.
Basically, except for one girl, it was a teenage girl. The rest of them, it was I don't care basically attitude, you know. And I try to get to these young people. You just took a human life, you know. And you went out afterwards. You did this. You went like one couple of them went to a local store, corner store, hung out with their friends. Some of them went just riding around the city, but it was like nothing, you know. It was one went back to school, went to a school in Georgia, and at that point tried to clean the evidence up by cleaning the trunk of a car, which had some of the blood left from Pedro Taylor there. And it was like they went on with their normal lives after this crime was committed. And it was amazing because we tried, when we reached out to some of these kids, I want to call them, they had no sense of what they did. It didn't affect them at all. And that's what surprised our detectives at Homicide.
And there's another case you talk about in your book where you talk about a young girl being murdered for her cell phone, and yes. Immediately after, the killer takes the half-eaten sandwich she was eating.
Yes.
And they pick it up and they continue to eat that sandwich from the victim. Talk about that case.
That's correct. This was Nicole Edmonds.
Nicole Edmonds.
A young girl, and this case really got to me because when we found Nicole's body underneath the JFX underneath the JFX bridge, I remember going to the hospital, and her father was leaning over top of her. Her father was a minister here in Baltimore City, and he was leaning over top of her, and it kind of like his daughter laying on the table. Every homicide detective is normal. They're normal as well. I have daughters that age. I had daughters that age. And it kind of make you draw back to, this could have been my daughter. And the only thing I could say to that man was, I promise you I will find out who did this. And he held me to that. And we began working on the case. And as a result, we came up with an individual who we brought in, involved in the case, who chased the young girl before she was killed, and who was with the suspect who actually stabbed her. And he gave us some information. And with that information, we were able to develop a suspect in this case and brought her in. Now, during that homicide, Nicole was slapped by the individual, the male teenager, and after the female teenager stabbed her, Nicole was getting off work at the Wendy's. She worked at Wendy's in Baltimore County, getting off the subway, and she had a sandwich in her hand, and she was going to finish off probably on her way home or when she get home. But this suspect, the teenage suspect who killed her, after she took Nicole's cell phone, she picked up the half-eaten sandwich and continued to eat it as they walked away from the scene.
And this young woman who was the suspect and who was convicted of this murder, she was, you call her a child herself, and her kind of life, her case represented a lot of what most vulnerable populations experience in the city, and the hopelessness and the desperation they feel.
That's correct. To me, she's a teenager, but to me, teenagers are kids. They're still developing, still learning. And when she committed this crime, she was smart enough to try to hide herself in Prince George's County, where we located her at, and she was arrested there. But she, no remorse at all.
She was 16 years old.
Yes, she's 16, with no remorse at all. And we interviewed her inside the interview room. Basically, hey, what's done is done. And we move on from there. And the young lady and the young man was involved in it. They went to jail for probably most of their young life. And it's basically, like I always say, your family is destroyed now because of what you did, and Nicole Edmonds' family is destroyed because she's not there anymore. So both families suffer at the end.
And you say this lack of empathy, it's a clue to this bigger problem. The reason, one of the reasons you feel there is so much murder and violence in this city. Talk about what the lack of empathy, what you feel stems from, and the overall society's responsibility.
Well, what I talked about before was the miseducation of some of these young people in Baltimore City. A lot of kids are joining gangs as early as middle school middle school grades, and now they're recruiting for middle school grades and high school grades. Fortunately, they're leaving the elementary school grades alone. And once they join these gangs, kids got to understand, once you're in a gang, you're in a gang. There's no way out other than death. And once they get in, they make these grown-up decisions. They can't get out of it, and they start doing things at the request of the gangs, breaking the law, even committing homicides. And a lot of that is based on gang affiliation.
One of the reasons that we use the idea of pathology as a metaphor, or as sort of representative, is that the murders and these behaviors, like lack of empathy, are symptoms to a certain extent of something that is communal. And so the lack of empathy that you see in children, I think, speaks wholly to the idea of how the community functions, and if the community is functional. And it speaks
if there even is a community.
If there even is a community, even better way of putting it, thank you. And that's why, because Kelvin would talk about these things, and I'd be like, are you serious? Or, even Devon Richardson, the 14-year-old who shot the woman and said, can I go home now, after he confessed to killing a 67-year-old lady. These things become symptomatic and symptoms that we sort of have to say is part of a larger problem. Now, of course, you don't want to take away personal responsibility in that equation. That's not fair. But if you see this kind of pattern consistently, and certainly that pattern emerges in the cases that Kelvin worked, then you have to start saying, okay, this is like intrinsic. Something systematic is happening, or something universal. These kids are having the same experiences. They're experiencing the same sort of issues, and they're ending up with the same sort of attitudes. What is it? And I think you're right, and it really is something vested in the community. And I think that's why we took that step of calling the book The Pathology of Murder, not just Murder in Baltimore, because we were trying to see, as people who care, where do these symptoms arise? Why is this community dysfunctional, and why does it end up in Kelvin's lap in these cases where he's in the box with these poor kids who have just basically eradicated a life, and at the same time we're not cognizant of what that means.
And you write in the book that these are populations that are ignored. They're they're disinvested from, and people that you only hear from once they kill someone else. That's the only reason they'd be on the map that anyone would know.
That is exactly the case. These cases create, the media, we cover it. If there is an outbreak of violence, we cover it. If there's a fight in the school, we cover it. But we go from crime to crime. It's one of the reasons we wrote the book, because as a reporter, we go from crime to crime to crime, but there's no connection between the two.
Right. I agree.
Okay, well, that wraps it up for this part of this discussion. In the next part, I want to talk about the two cases in your book which personally affected you and had like a huge impact on you as a person and your career. So I want to thank you both for joining us again for this segment. And thank you for joining us at therealnews.com.